Hello everyone. Today we're talking about the Cold War and why America and the Soviet Union distrusted each other so much to the point of going crazy trying to outdo each other for 46 years. Right? So let's get started. All right, so we have to go about 100 years before the end of World War II to 1848 when Karl Marx and Frederick Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. Right, so in the Communist Manifesto, they basically make this critique of capitalism, and in a long story short kind of way, they critique the idea that capitalism just perpetuates the idea of the rich becoming richer and the poor becoming poorer, right? The exploitation of the workers, that the concentration of wealth is always going to be on the side of the rich and is never going to go to the poor, and is going to perpetuate the cycle of classes that is never going to be broken, right? So they basically envision a world in which we have a classless, stateless society that can only be achieved through a revolution. So to achieve this, they envision the abolition of private property, right? And they also seek the idea of the people as a society owning all the means of production. Okay, that means uh, the resources, the land, the factories, you know, the society as a whole, rather than a select few, own everything. All right, and also the establishment of a government of a dictatorship of the proletariat. All right, so again, a government led by workers, by regular people. Right, so this is the vision, the communist envision to fix the problems brought by capitalism. Right, a redistribution of wealth according to necessities. Okay, so in itself, this philosophy is not incredibly crazy to have this big distrust that the U.S. has with the Soviet Union in the 1940s. But the reality is that the philosophy is one thing, but the actions of it are going to be very different, right? So fast forward to the early 1900s during the Gilded Age, and the Communist Manifesto becomes way more popular because things get a little bit worse, right? During this Gilded Age, we do see this bigger wage discrepancy between the rich and the poor. The Communist Manifesto becomes way more popular. In 1917, we had the Bolshevik Revolution that is inspired by the ideas of Karl Marx to have this, abolition of private property, this redistribution of wealth. They're trying to establish this dictatorship of the proletariat. And the reality is that one of the main reasons that Americans distrust the Soviet Union are two, right? And the main reason, well, the number one reason is going to be how incredibly violent the communist revolution becomes in the 1920s and 30s. Okay, so for example, I'm gonna give you three examples of how violent this communist revolution was during the 1920s and 30s. Okay, and so there are three examples how these communist revolution became incredibly violent during the 1920s and 30s. And the first one is collectivization. Okay, so the idea of collectivization was, once again, they're going to abolish private property. Now the country owns all the private property, including all the farms, and now the peasants are going to farm as a collective, right? So rather than they selling their crops on the market, they're going to farm, give it to the government, and the government will see to either sell this or redistribute. Any farmer that refused this idea of the abolition of their private property was seen as an enemy of the state. Okay, and this idea of collectivization became incredibly violent, guys, because anyone who opposed the idea of collectivization was either sent to the camps, arrested, or executed, right? And this was a reality for almost a million people, right? About a million people were dispossessed of their properties. They were either executed, they were sent to the gulags. We don't always have exact numbers because this is the Soviet Union, this is the 1920s, and we don't have exact numbers. but the estimates are always around 1 million or 2 million people, right? That suffer throughout all of this. Okay, and the main people who were seen as the enemies are the people who Stalin named as kulaks, right? So let me explain to you who are the kulaks. Okay, so what you see here, and I'm gonna read from the translation. It says, kulaks are the most brutal, the most crude, the most savage exploiters, who are more than once in the history of the countries have restored the power of landlords, czars, priests, and capitalists. This is by Vladimir Lenin. And the bottom of the text says, down with the kulak from the collective farm. Okay, so um, Stalin mobilize the entire propaganda machine and mobilize everyone in the Soviet Union to persecute anyone who's a kulak. A kulak is just a wealthy farmer, right? Anyone who has more than two tractors, anyone who has a hired hand, anyone that is an intellectual, anyone who is not on board with the idea of the redistribution of wealth, anyone who's not in the idea of the abolition of private property, who has a little bit more than the rest of anyone else, is considered a kulak and was considered an enemy of the state. And Stalin had no reparation in executing these people, in sending them to jail or sending them to the gulags, right? So let me show you another example of kulaks. Okay, so the text at the top says strike at the kulak, and the bottom text says who agitates for reducing sowing. Okay, so this is another example of propaganda against the kulak, all right? So is they are labeled as Christian people who are rich, who are overweight, who are greedy, who are people who are not in the plan of Stalin for the redistribution of wealth, enemy of the state, and Stalin will make him the number one enemy, right? So the US is watching from far away how this very repressive, this very violent regime is going, changing society in Russia. And they're, of course, watching with very careful eyes, right? The idea of this regime is becoming extremely violent. Yep. All right, so collectivization and the dekulakization is one. Collectivization leading to what is called the Holodomor is number two, and that is basically a time when Stalin made a man-made famine and starved millions of Ukrainians because they couldn't comply with the quotas of the farm that he demanded of them. And this is just another example of how horrible and how horrifying this uh, regime became. These people were starved to death, right? Because Stalin blamed them for not complying with the quotas, and he basically made them enemies of the state because he blamed them for the reason we are not meeting the quotas, the reason we're not meeting our plans to to modernize the nation is because the Ukrainians are not complying, right? So he starved them to death, right? He created a man-made famine that is estimated to have left about 5 million people. So that is number two, right? So, and number three is the Great Purge, right? The Great Purge is a time, and it's also called the Great Terror, and it's a period of time in the late 1920s and early 1930s in which Stalin ordered the persecution of political opposition, ordinary citizens, and also his own party members. Anyone he suspected to be people who are acting against the interests of the Soviet Union, all right? About 1.5 million people were either sent to the camps, gulags, put to jail, or executed in these show trials, through this Great Purge, right? About 1.5 million people suffer this great terror, right? When basically Stalin got rid of anyone who suspected to be against the state, right? And you could be an ordinary citizen, you could be a political opponent, you could be members of your own party who you suspect that could be in cahoots with someone else. you know all these things combined are really making the US really not trust the idea of the Soviet Union, right? Really not like the idea of communism. Okay. And so what is going to happen is then when World War II happens, you know, this is the least likely ally we're going to have, because nothing could be more at odds with the American philosophy of, individualism, of private property, of, the meritocracy, everything that stands for our American principles, than what you're seeing this communist revolution is causing. However, we do have a common enemy, who is Adolf Hitler. So the alliance between the US and the Soviet Union during World War II can be best described as the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In other words, you hate Hitler, we hate Hitler, let's hate Hitler together, let's get rid of him. But once we get rid of him, we do realize that we're not friends, we're actual enemies. Okay? And the other big reason why we're not going to trust the Soviet Union is because during this time we realize that Stalin is not meeting his promises of liberating East Europe. Let me explain. Okay, so during the Soviet advance towards Berlin, the Soviets were supposed to be liberating all of East Europe. Okay, so on their way to Moscow to Berlin, they're, rather than liberating, they are occupying Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. These countries were supposed to have been liberated from the Nazis. However, rather than being liberated, they're being occupied by the Soviets. And there is not a lot of things America and Britain can do to make Stalin leave. All right. So this is just raising the distrust of the Americans and the Soviets way, way more. Okay. And to add to that, during the last conference that Americans and Soviets have, the US already have developed an atomic bomb, and Stalin, through his network of spies, are aware of this, right? But because the US does not disclose this information to the Soviets, Stalin begins also to suspect the Americans and begin to distrust them, all right? So we are deeply distrustful of each other, and things are not about to get better. Okay. There's a couple quotes from Stalin that reflect a lot his philosophy on politics, on everything. And one of them is, that resolves everything. No man, no problem. So this is a man who really doesn't have a lot of regard for human life, and he believes, getting rid of the people is the best way to get rid of the problem, right? Uh, the other very famous quote is, uh, "It doesn't matter who votes. What matters is who counts the votes." Right? So in this idea of a democracy, in the idea of self-determination, Stalin is not very concerned about these things, right? And Winston Churchill used to say that having a deal with Stalin was like holding hands with the devil, right? And so there is a lot of people who do see Stalin as a worse version of Adolf Hitler, right? And it's an interesting concept once you think about it, right? So as you can see, we have plenty of reasons to distrust the Soviet Union. The philosophy itself, it's a little utopian. It's a little, it is hoping for the best. And although Karl Marx doesn't actually call for repression, oppression, he doesn't call for, persecution of political opponents. He doesn't call for these things. He does call for a revolution. And the way it takes shape is in the way of political repression, repression, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, this big propaganda states. uh, it is having this incredible humanitarian crisis, the whole of the war, the Great Purge, the collectivization, the decolonization, that is leaving dozens of millions of life, right, that are lost in the path to trying to achieve this communist utopia, right? But it's just not happening, right? So from afar, from where the US is seeing this, we're very concerned about, like, this is not the future, right? This is not the way to go, right? Your philosophy may be calling for these things, but the actions are showing otherwise, right? Millions of people of death, people losing their private property, and these people that are dying, that are being sent to camps, that are being, put in jail, they're not criminals per se, right? These are people who do not agree with the vision. These are people who don't want to have a redistribution of wealth. These are people who don't want to have an abolition of their private property. These are people who just basically don't agree with you philosophically, politically. And their response to this is we need to get rid of anyone who doesn't agree with us, right? And this is why the regime becomes very oppressive, extremely repressive of any individual freedoms, and is extremely, extremely anti-American. So post World War II, when we're looking at how do we avoid the next war, America believes that our system is the best way to avoid it, and the Soviets believe our system, if it works, is going to be the best way to avoid it. And so the way we see it is no, all right? We're at odds with each other. The Americans see the Soviets as the enemy, as this will be the source of World War III. And the Soviets see the same with the Americans, right? They distrust us. They believe our system is only going to continue perpetuating, these injustices, these inequalities, and that the only way to get rid of them is through the establishment of a communist regime. All right. So, anyways, guys, this is the short story of why do we distrust each other, the idea of why the Soviets and why the Americans, were at odds during the 1940s, 50s, all the way until 1991 at the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let me know, what do you think? Is communism really achievable? Is it really attainable? And let me know if you want me to talk a little bit more about what is a little bit more popular today, which is socialism, which is meant to be the in-between state between capitalism and communism. The in-between state is supposed to be socialism. It's becoming popular. There's more countries popping up more with this idea. So let me know what you think if you want me to talk a little bit more about that. And I don't want to take much more of your time. I'll see you guys later and be safe. Okay.